Testing, 1, 2. Can you hear okay?
Very well, yes, loud and clear.
They ask people to mute themselves, please, Yogesh.
Yeah, everyone kind of muted. Amma, do you have music in the background? Is that your music?
Everyone mute themselves, please.
Sorry.
That was Amma, he had some background music. Okay, Amma, go ahead. Please introduce Dan Winter.
Okay, our next speaker is a mind-blowing scientist and a great teacher of what borders on magic. Truth, you will soon find out. But regardless, strap down to your seats because you're about to go on a fascinating journey. So without no further ado, it is a tremendous honor for me to introduce to you my nominee for the Right Livelihood Award, because he's 2 out of the box for the Nobel, my friend, Dan Winter.
Thank you, Amar. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. So this lecture is about the science and the physics of bliss and Kundalini. And in the process of learning how peak experience, peak perception, bliss, and Kundalini work, we're going to include some pretty powerful physics about how all centripetal and negentropic, we call them fractal or phase conjugate forces, work. For example, gravity and consciousness itself. Now, you know, supposedly physics doesn't really know why an object falls to the ground. Physics doesn't know why any centripetal force exists. It turns out that gravity and consciousness and bliss have something directly physical in common, and that is that they're centripetal, implosive, attractive to charge. They cause charge to compress at center. And that power to implode or become centripetal is not just the very nature of power itself, and the very nature of consciousness itself, the nature of bliss itself, the nature of vision itself. There are so many things that we can understand if we know how electric fields implode and compress. Now, we're going to be describing, as a physics of consciousness, essentially how a vortex tube of charge gets centripetal like a tornado and develops an eyeball at center. And that's literally the phase conjugate or fractal physics of perception. Now, many physicists today even agree that fractality is the cause of gravity. What they don't know yet is how. And what we've learned is the answer to that question is quite simple. It's something called the golden mean ratio, which is self-similarity perfected and therefore fractality perfected and therefore compression perfected. And we're going to see that the solution to compression is the solution to almost every problem we have today. Evolution of computers is about the history of successful compression. Evolution of consciousness, the history of successful. The evolution of urban design is the history of successful compression. How to die successfully is successful compression. How to do fusion energy, successful compression. How to do alchemy. You see, all of these questions end with a simple physics, which is how to implode charge, how to make a vortex tube come to a point of perfect compression. Now, it turns out that point of perfect compression is something called the Planck length and time, 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, which turns out to be simply the musical key signature of every wave that physics has ever measured. It's the musical key signature of the universe. So you take this musical key signature and you multiply by golden ratio and keep doing that, golden ratio times golden ratio, called exponents of golden ratio, you have a three-dimensional fractal waveform called a caduceus from Hermes, which in physics is called phase conjugation. And it's that path of waves cascading in that harmonic series or imploding that makes perfect compression. Now, we're going to show you lots of slides and pictures of that, but here's an example of the 3D model. In this dodeca, Ecosa dodeca, the only possible three-dimensional fractal, called the Star Mother kit, goldenmean.info/kit, which I later proved is how hydrogen is built, as well as DNA and every living protein. You have this geometry of implosive compression because the x, y, and z coordinate of every vertex infinitely in this nest is a simple multiple of that same golden mean ratio. And that creates something called embeddability or perfect nesting, which in physics today it's fashionable to call it entanglement. But embeddability or perfect nesting, compression perfected, is that literally the ability of the little wave to exist inside the bigger wave non-destructively, which golden mean ratio is now, we have proven, the mathematical solution to that non-destructive or constructive interference of all waves. And I would caution you about one other thing. You know, some people might sit back and say, well, he's only talking about the physical body here, and I'm interested in the spiritual body. And to those who would say that, I would recommend the same therapy that we in physics recommend to, in physics today, those who think that gravity is made of a different substance than electromagnetism. For those people, we recommend hospitalization for schizophrenia, because the unified field is the opposite of that. And that also is profoundly true about the relationship of your physical body to your spiritual body. We're going to learn the spiritual body is quite literally the sense of the Ba and the Ka and the Kesjan body and the rainbow light body, and what allows you to lucid dream and take memory through death measurably, is a bubble of charge called, it's an imploding bubble of charge called a longitudinal electromagnetic field, a compression wave that can propagate at nodes which are fractal and look like that dodecahedron. Point being is that there's no real way to understand your spiritual body without looking at the physics of compression. For example, when we show the geometry you see when you die, the Heinrich-Klue waveform constants, we're seeing that successful death is an electrical black hole, and to do it right is to understand compression very well. And you see, when we understand the physics, that's when we begin to understand the psychology, because that perfectly shareable wave at the center of compression, propagating like a fractal from Planck, is literally the psychology and physics of pure intention. How to be a shareable wave means how to identify with the pure principle of wave propagation efficiency, which is the only principle of survival for waves and people. So when you identify the pure principle in every situation, you've suddenly enabled compression. In fact, in psychology, they call it the collapse process. Well, guess what? Einstein named the unified field principle was non-destructive charge collapse. So you see that we must really understand our spiritual wave mechanics in terms of the physics. And then ultimately, when we grow up and learn the position of humans in the solar system and galaxy, we're going to learn that those who would enslave us, hint Draco and others, what they have that we don't is this ability to compress charge very well, implode the field, and you feel a vice-like grip here. And you can measure that amount of implosive compression of field effect in your aura, in your brain waves. And we see the slide, Bill Tiller measured how much compression of charge focused attention causes, one of the physical correlates of what is attention, and thereby measure consciousness. Isn't that fun? So you would like to evolve? Well, guess what? The solution is simple: implode or die. It's very close to the corollary of our favorite bumper sticker, which is get fractal or get dead. Okay, so now I'm going to try this share screen here. Let's see if we can share the slides. I'm clicking on share. Hopefully you can see my screen here. So I'm going to just move this around a little bit here. And move this one here.
It's clear, we can see it very well.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so now we're in the frame. Okay, so this is our slide. So the slides, the lectures about bliss, the climax form of bliss, Kundalini, is the charge radiance which results from charge or plasma implosion. And to understand that well, we need to understand the physics of consciousness itself, which now we know is an imploding plasma or vortex, which forms a tornado or an eyeball. And we'll see later that those who are trying to talk about a physics of consciousness and can't explain why focused attention compresses charge do not have a physics of consciousness. And those who are trying to talk about a physics of consciousness and can't explain why your vision can go outside your body when you lucid dream, when you remote view, when you astral project, and when you die. You know, the medical surgeons, dozens of them, who came back from death and measured where they looked from outside their own body and watched the surgeon's instrument cutting inside their head, the position from which they saw outside your body, their own body, we can explain by the charged permissive environment called fractal or sacred space that enabled the imploding vortex donut of plasma named your consciousness. So anybody who's talking about the physics of consciousness and can't explain how your eyeball can move outside your head don't actually have a clue, unfortunately. So understanding this physics of consciousness then is going to help us understand how implosion of charge creates bliss and radiance, and therefore intense bliss, Kundalini. So it explains, this model explains how plasma implosion rejuvenates or heals. Our therify.net will show you slides. B, it explains why conscious focus compresses charge. Measurements, Bill Tiller, we see the slide. It explains, C, where vision occurs when people see from outside their body. D, it explains how blindfolded kids start seeing without their eyes, and they always report, I'm seeing through a vortex or a tube. And we're going to explain that physics. It explains, E, why imploding brainwave frequencies, and we'll see examples, golden ratio, alpha, beta, gamma, cause inner vision and bliss, Kundalini. We'll explain why death visions, the Cuvée geometric sequence seen during death, the map to dying, is braid implosion. And we also now know the infrasound heard during successful death. A black hole is required in order to compress, implode your charge through the Planck threshold into the longitudinal array called the collective unconscious, and we'll talk more about that. G, how and why death visions are contagious. You know, the surgeons are all clear. Death visions are contagious electrically. The other surgeons in the room all see the same thing. Now we know why. It will explain why cold spot measures indicate the presence of ghosts, because that implosion actually sucks in heat called negentropy. It explains why ghosts require sacred space or charge implosion. Korotkov measured where ghosts, your plasma body, goes after death, and we know why. Because in order for a ghost to be delivered, it needs to implode, compress charge, and then be distributed at a higher voltage frequency called a longitudinal fractal field, which is how the collective unconscious, communion of saints, the Akashic records, etc., DNA radio, as it were, it all propagates as a longitudinal fractal field, and in order to get in or out of there successfully requires that knowledge of the high voltage compression effect, which is why successful birth and death, which should be blissful, are always an implosive black hole. It explains why ball lightning is demonstrably responsive to telepathy. So again, these are some examples of how the fractal field works. Now let me see if I can advance the slides here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to have to get better at this. Identifying and teaching bliss or Kundalini, implosive attractive charge compression or radiance, uses Dan Whitmire origin of negentropy equation. It's the only possible 3D fractal, and it is Planck times golden ratio times golden ratio times golden ratio, and you keep doing it. So Planck times golden ratio to the exponent of integer n, called the origin of biologic negentropy, my discovery and equation, and the title of my book, fractalfield.com, predicts the necessary optimum biofeedback, brainwave harmonics, sacrocranial harmonics, breath harmonics, heart rate variability, heart harmonics. It predicts the binaural beat audio harmonics of bliss, predicts the plasma implosion of bliss and Kundalini, predicts the charge harmonics for sacred space required for Kundalini and bliss, etc. And so examples of that will be in all the succeeding slides. So you see that once you know this frequency signature and can identify, it makes it teachable with biofeedback, and we can understand the pure principle. So this is the equation in general. This is called origin of biologic negentropy, and you see at the top Planck length or time times golden ratio of the integer n, and that will then project this line of frequency harmonics caduceus, named for Hermes, called phase conjugation in physics, and that predicts the 3 exact radii of hydrogen, the ADP wavelength on 1.93 angstroms, most important molecule in the body. It predicts the only 2 exact precise frequencies of photosynthesis, which is caused by fractal phase conjugation. It predicts the definition of all sacred length, that resonance embeddable, including the British foot, and we'll see that slide. It predicts the frequencies of the Schumann harmonics and the brainwave harmonics, which are the same to produce bliss and Kundalini. It predicts the most important frequency of the blood, called the Mayer wave, 0.1 hertz, we'll see that slide, the LF component of the HRV. It predicts the Venus year, Earth year, galactic year, and precessional year. All those wavelengths are predicted by this equation, which is the solution to fractality, and therefore the solution to negentropy, and therefore the only path out of chaos. And again, all of this is at fractalfield.com, and it might be a little more science than you wanted, but at least a little background. So, this compelling fractal physics predicts, and it's, by the way, animated in 3D at goldenmean.info/grail, and you can see that. And the book is at fractalfield.com/fractalspacetime. So, it predicts the generalized wave geometric cause of gravity, life force, biologic negentropy, and bliss, Kundalini. It predicts how wave geometry creates negentropy, the only way out of chaos. It predicts how the Earth and Schumann harmonics makes Gaia self-organizing, called negentropy. We now know how Gaia became self-organizing. It's the only wave geometry which defines a fractal field, hence fractalfield.com. This is the only exact wavelength, and here I talk about, again, hydrogen radii, the same thing we just talked about in the previous slide. Notice on the right that the LF component of the HRV, 0.1 hertz, which is predicted by the equation, is also the Mayer wave, the most important frequency of the blood, and the most important frequency to breathe, 0.1 hertz, to make Kundalini, the Mayer wave. The essence of all heart coherence training is that 0.1 hertz Mayer wave breathing, for example, iThrive.com. And the other famous heart rate variability frequency, 0.251 hertz, the HF component of heart rate variability, is also fitting the equation. So I promise you that I will stop with the with the physics here in a moment. See if I can get my screen image correctly. But I just want to show you that we have published in the physics literature. These are the 2 papers we've published. You can see them at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy and fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. This is my last slide. Most of the rest will be graphic. But this is the physics literature. And these are 2 physics literature publications where we have proven in wave equations what I'm about to tell you. Here's the 3 radii of hydrogen. They're multiples of golden ratio. That perfects compression. So phase conjugate fractality is the reason hydrogen exists and the reason mechanism that allow hydrogen to make gravity, why an object falls to the ground. Because when the waves converge in that golden ratio pent, they add and multiply recursively, constructively, not just wavelength, but phase velocity. And that turns compression of charge into acceleration of charge towards center, the origin of all centripetal forces, and the reason objects fall to the ground. And so the other publication we have here, Fractal Golden Ratio Phase Conjugation, Cause of Gravity. And you can see those publications at the 2 links on the top here, Vacuum Energy and Conjugate Gravity. So I promise, we go to pictures now, a little less physics and hopefully more fun. So this is how you visualize it, the stellation of the dodecaecosa, recursive heterodyning, cause of gravity. And you see here, golden ratio is simply you add any 2 numbers, you get the following, or you multiply any number by 1.618 and you get the next number. 1.618 squared is 2.618, etc. So that's called arithmetic and geometric progression, and that turns out what waves have to do, recursively add and multiply, to constructively interfere. And the solution to constructive interference is the solution to every problem we've ever had, including how people can get along. And again, just another way to visualize it. So it's basically teaching donuts how to nest nicely. Now, the important thing about this is that when waves of electromagnetic field called transverse, waves that go up and down like this, and we have an animation of that in a moment, that's called transverse electromagnetic, which is all our communications and the way all of physics uses electromagnetics for communication, radio, is the transverse up and down component. But when the wave enters the perfect vortex, what we've just defined, which is a caduceus on a perfect cone. It's a 60-degree cone, by the way. When the wave travels down that cone, it converts the up and down inertia to transverse. And that up and down transverse electromagnetic will never implode, never get centripetal, and never propagate into the collective unconscious. No, it has to go down that cone, implode, and emerge out the squirt gun at the threshold defined by Planck right there, like toothpaste out the tube. And when it does, then the wave propagates as a compressional wave called longitudinal electromagnetic, incorrectly sometimes called scalar or torsional. And that is DNA radio. That's the way it works. So here we can just animate a little bit of that. Let's see if our movies are working. Yeah. So that's the physics of all spiritual phenomena. All action at a distance is how that longitudinal wave propagates on the bottom. Compare that with the more nervous transverse wave at the top. So the waves that go far are compressional, like the portion of the tsunami that went along wave. You don't even know it's passing by you when you're in the boat at the surface because it's longitudinal. So this is introduction to a fractal conjugate wave array. Remember, at these nodes of the Earth grid, which are dodecacosa, sometimes called sacred space, nuclear radioactive critical mass is reduced, and telepathy is possible, and all sacred space is created, all labyrinths, cathedrals, Cozy Rev mirrors, all of them were put at these longitudinal nodes, and that's the way the ancients, with the famous power transmission without wires called the array of the pyramids around the surface of the Earth, are at a dodecacosa because they're at the nodes. It's the only solution to power distribution without wires. So we say that Tesla didn't get it quite right, and that's why he didn't succeed, because he didn't use the right frequencies and he didn't use the right fractal nodes to achieve power distribution without wires. Now, why are we talking about power distribution without wires when we're supposed to be talking about Kundalini and Bliss? Well, hello, they're the same thing. Isn't that cool? That if you want to have distribution without power, without wires, you need to know what the fractal grid is, because that's what you have to get inside of in order to. So Tesla's mistakes, 60 hertz was wrong frequency, so it would never implode, because it's not a multiple of Planck, whereas 50 hertz will. That's also why you can do carbon nano at the right frequency and not the wrong. So this is just how does that fractal phase conjugate compression causing gravity become constructive, implosive, and centripetal? It's the old transverse story. Transverse versus longitudinal. And so how you phase conjugate waves is, an example on the right bottom, is how lasers phase conjugate. It's called four-wave mixing. In sacred religious story, it's called the sacred four directions. It's the reason Agnihotra works at sunrise and sunset. Because when you have this right angle approach of the vortex, they can implode accurately in phase conjugate. And that's how lasers first created time reversal and negentropy in measurements in physics, phase conjugate optics. So you need this accurate arrival. And you see inside that famous dodeca, there's a tetracube. And that's how you start these things. So this is an example. Now we're going to go to the various examples. During Bliss, this happens to be me, and this is me generating 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 brainwave harmonics in golden mean ratio. And that is an implosive cascade that identifies the onset of bliss. And this is after perhaps 30 years of Kundalini. I may be the one who's made the most harmonics in golden mean ratio we've ever measured. This is from flameinmind.com. Now, we can animate a little bit of how that looks like. Let's see if we can play that. So at Flame in Mind, you know why we call it a flame in mind? When Ingo Swann lit that thermistor, the flame, with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage repeatedly in a laboratory was measured. So he created heat at a distance with his mind, what Einstein incorrectly called spooky. Actually, the reaction at a distance is because he made this cascade of golden ratio harmonics, imploding charge, with his mind, and launched a longitudinal wave. And when these longitudinal waves cross again at a distance, those nodes resynthesize the transverse heat-containing component. The only physics of action at a distance, and the only physics then of how ancestor memory works, and we want to talk a bit more about that. But first, we're going to describe a practical example. Here's our school in Netherlands, where we're teaching kids to see without their eyes using biofeedback. And this is our hero, the young lady. She's blindfolded, and she's seeing without her eyes. And you can see all these animations and films and documentaries, and the new professional documentary film about it, about seeing without their eyes, at flameinmind.com/outer vision. Point here being that at the moment, when the kids see that little vortex form inside their head, the beginning of imploding, the crackling of the pineal that our previous speaker was speaking about, Miracle, about the inner eye that opens. This is how, this is the measurement, this is the physics, that there's actually a cascade of harmonics here in blue at golden ratio and pink at octave. And that cascade of harmonics in the brainwave implodes. It like grabs the vortex by the throat and focuses it. And then when it comes in, it's funny that Patrick Botti, who I think is with us here, and Patrick wrote all the software, flameinmind.com, iThrive.com. But Patrick said that when he was sitting next to her and she was teaching him, suddenly when he had his own eyes closed, he began to see little shadows inside like he was beginning to see without his eyes. Why? Because the vortex was forming perfect compression of plasma inside the head. So phase conjugate spectrally implosive charge implosion causes not just gravity, but life force, consciousness, peak perception, kundalini, and bliss. The more broad spectral the frequency implosion, the more negentropic. That's why you could say, well, is gravity self-aware? Well, if you track the gravity wave through your feet to the center of the earth and to the center of the sun with your attention, an ancient shamanic ritual, you get a clue. All frequency implosion, negentropy in life, and gravity maintenance obey the equation origin of negentropy. The only access to longitudinal fractal charge interferometry is not only just a way to stabilize gravity and atmosphere and human bliss, it is the only doorway to the collective unconscious, DNA radio, the communion of saints, ancestor memory, Akashic record, the so-called next dimension, rainbow light body, etc., etc. And at these nodes, the sacred space on the earth, and we'll show 4 ways it's measured, you have the military quality telepathy from Cozy Rev, you have labyrinths, cathedrals, ancestor phone calls, because you had to be where the nodes are of this longitudinal array for this compression to work and create this distribution. So the formation of this coherent EMF longitudinally projective charge bubble around the human body aura, resulting from phase conjugate fractal charge implosion or bliss, precludes and indicates ability to lucid dream, remote view, astral project, definition of Shem On, the On sun god that makes the Shem black hole, and take memory through death, sometimes called this is what a soul is. This has been called the Kesjan body, the Ba from the Ka, the Pearl of Ascension, the 5D aura, the rainbow light body. Let's have some physics here so all we woo-woos can get on the same page, because that's what makes a wave shareable, is measurement. Here's an example. Now we discuss the physics of emotion. So on the bottom right, we have tens of thousands of measurements of emotion by Manfred Klein's The Centix work. And the wave shape of emotion is well identified in the physics of music. So if you do measure 100,000 people expressing love and have them press their violin string, or simply a spring, and measure the change in pressure over time, you get the wave shape, which is the physics of love. Note the moment of maximum pressure arrives at 0.618 into the duration of that touch. So by creating, which is also the perfect point of maximum pressure for a birth canal that allows memory through birth. Okay, it's the physics of rebirthing. So that possibility of implosion in compression, identifying the physics of the touch that says, I love you, versus the moment of maximum pressure in the joy wave is 1/6. It's hex, spatial, space filling, but not implosive. Whereas anger, notably, is 1/7, which is maximum destructive wave interference. Now notice where there's lots of this conversation about fear here. Fear has not ever been graphed. You know, all the studies, the physics of emotion is well documented. We know the wave shape, but the wave shape of fear, why could they never measure that? Because that's resistance to all of spin. That's why it's the mind killer. So here's the classic conversation about, see the ghost here. This ghost was more visible because this is a forest. If this had been a hospital, this compressional wave, named your ghost or spirit after death, would not have been visible because the dielectric constant of the electrosmog in that hospital full of metal prevents the propagation of charge, prevents sacred space, literally creating hell for death, which is why a hospital is a hell of a place to die. No, I mean, but enabled compression of charge creates a bubble of charge around your body, the longitudinal field, which is able to propagate coherently here at death, at lucid dream, at shamanic projection, those sorts of things. That is a plasma bubble. And we're going to show a bunch of ways in which that has been measured, including, this is Korotkov. This is called the soul. What is the soul? Light after light. This is him measuring where the ghost goes after death. He measured that it goes to the place of compression of charge in the room because it has to gain centripetal inertia or the ghost is stuck, which is why, for example, Therify.net, our plasma, is so good at helping ghosts actually be delivered, to release them, because they need the implosion of charge in order to be distributed, to be redeemed, as it were. Also, we've measured with Korotkov the number of hours it takes for the soul to leave the body after death, and why. Actually 10 and 36 hours, consistent with the Tibetans, because if you measure the Kirlian of the fingertip, you can measure when the spirit leaves the body, and it's well defined and understood. And these are the famous Heinrich Clouvet form constant lattice cobweb tunnel spiral that you will see if your death is successful. And this is the map to successful death because it's the map to implosion. The DNA has to be a lattice and then a cobweb. Here's the lattice, here's the cobweb, here's the tunnel, here's the spiral. And that's the process of DNA imploding and inserting you into this longitudinal array of the collective unconscious, delivering your ghost, as it were, which is why successful death is a black hole. Notably, recently, with the help of our wonderful friend Danny Schreiber, who died recently, he came back, and through his lucid dreaming partner, reported that this was accompanied correctly by an infrasound, a low-frequency rumble you hear during successful death, which is good physics because that is also part of the implosion process, and the physics of how we make the perfect binaural beat for bliss, and the physics of how we measured at Sam Pyramid in Bosnia the infrasound that makes rejuvenation, which is why all the people come there. So this becomes the definition of sacred space in a room where charge implodes, literally. And this also then is how we cause electric fields to implode, which is how you make a seed or a child germinate. So we now use this to define sacred space, literally sacred architecture. We're going to show you now, here's sacred space on the left, and here is hell, otherwise known as a modern hospital, on the right. The modern hospital, otherwise known as hell, is full of metal and electrosmog and the wrong frequencies and the wrong capacitance and the wrong dielectric constant and the wrong air, everything that prevents life or charge from propagating, and we call that a hospital. I think it's actually kind of funny. But I was never more nauseated pretty much in my whole life than when I walked down that hallway in that hospital, actually. So here we're demonstrating from our world successful biologic architecture curriculum, the Architecture for Bliss, at goldenmean.info/architecture, in which we define 3 ways to measure whether a building will cause a seed or a child to grow, and thus how to determine which architect deserves the paycheck. So one form of measurement here is the GDV technique, which is basically charge radiance. So that similar to when Korotkov followed the Kogi to where they make phone calls to ancestors, he called the air measurably fractal. And this is how he measured it, measuring the fractality of the aura with the GDV technology. So this is one way to measure sacred space and predict whether a building is alive or dead. A second way here is measuring the harmonics or power spectra. Let's see if I can put this in. Yeah. So measuring seed germination is a way to measure sacred. You literally measure seed germination. The second way is on top. We missed that. The second way is flameinmind.com/lifeforce. With the help of Patrick, we measure the harmonic content of the weak capacitive field. We spectrum analyze a microphone the same way we do a brainwave. And we can measure which egg is fresh and which tomato is fresh. And we could tell the difference between alive and dead rose oil, actually. So this is called fractality in modern architecture. And as you can see, this is not a new idea. You know, this was invented in Africa. Fractality was how architecture was discovered in Africa. So examples of the commercial success of teaching the physics of charge implosion, as the physics of life, would be Therify.net, our plasma rejuvenation tech, which is successful in 25 countries. We're doing rejuvenation, pain relief, all this. Therefore, and theimploder.com will show you pictures of water implosion, and flameinmind.com, where we teach implosion in brainwaves, and the Flame in Sound software, Flame in Mind, which is the perfect binaural bliss, and iThrive.com, where we teach the heart harmonics, and coming soon, we're going to make gravity. So these are the pictures of implosion in water from theimploder.com. This is a new commercial version, virtually indestructible ultra imploder. You can see it at theimploder.com. And this is how it works. You have a little vortex. And we did the CAD CAM to make that vortex implode because we took the 10 spirals of the golden mean down that perfect cone, and that is the perfect vortex. We call it Schauberger's dream, and it's a commercial proof of concept. Living water. This is our Therify.net plasma system, just so you get a little sense of how we make implosive plasma. And remember, since we're talking about the physics of bliss here, approximately 30%, particularly of sensitive, more women than men, thank you to our previous speaker, 30% of women report some bliss or euphoria in the plasma of implosion. And approximately 30% of people who experience this report some sharpening of vision. So and pain reduction, we'll look at that in a minute, that pain is restored compression. So again, the physics of how this works, it's based on Antoine Priory, who famously in France healed thousands of cancers, but nobody knew the physics until me. What I discovered was, we look at Priory's frequencies here, 3, 10, 32, and 80. I discovered that those frequencies fit my equation. Here's my frequency in my equation. And therefore, I discovered the principle behind Priory, and so we were able to optimize it, create perfected phase conjugation, plasma implosion, and therefore successfully create a rejuvenation plasma field, literally bliss in plasma. And note here, elaborate stories of the effect on plant growth and seed growth related to the concept of bliss. We can make plants grow, and there's all kinds of stories about the flowers across the street at the flower shop with the Therify in Nashville, Tennessee, last twice as long. So here's another, using the GDV, measuring before and after of the aura turning toward bliss after Therify plasma, after literally an implosion field. This was done in London. And you see there was 28% more energy reserved by measurement. All of this is the GDV technology from Korotkov, biowell.eu. This is the actual harmonics of sonic implosion, the bliss sound from flameinmind.com/flameinsound. The Flame in Sound Bliss binaural is very inexpensive at flameinmind.com. And it's programmable. You can make these bliss audio harmonics and make this implosive cascade, and you, in a way, it drives you out of your head, it implodes, and that's the beginning of bliss in sound in the brainwave. This is another example, and this is again thanks to Patrick Botti, who is here with us. Measuring life force and sacred space, in this case in a tree. The presence of the Schumann harmonics, in blue here, indicates the presence of the life force centripetal implosive Schumann cascade, which is negentropic of the earth, and the presence of that in the tree is indicative of the life of that tree. This is an example of measuring life force. So now we know what life force is, implosive charge. We know how life force is quantized, Planck, and we know how to measure and produce life force commercially with charge implosion. So this is just the history of bliss in brainwave and binaural beat harmonics from the original Flame in Sound website, honoring Patrick Botti, who did so much work in this regard, and the Mayer wave work, etc. And this is just a little review of how the vowel tones, if you say a, e, o, u correctly, here's the power spectra of aum on the right top. You say aum correctly. You make this harmonic cascade, and you see the caduceus of implosion, the still point at the end, the ohm experience of perfect implosive sound, exemplified by the sound ohm. Here you see on the top of this caduceus we've been talking about, you see these are the frequencies in blue predicted by my equation, 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, etc. And these are the frequencies at the bottom of the actual Schumann harmonics. You see? So we're just showing you how implosion, negentropy is the reason Gaia, Schumann, is self-organizing, negentropy. And at top, you see the only two frequencies of photosynthesis. We'll see it better here. It's on the right now. So the only two frequencies of photosynthesis, literally bliss-inducing, 427 nanometer and 691 nanometer, purple and orange. Those are the only two frequencies that motorize photosynthesis. If you do something else, like green, you prevent photosynthesis. And those frequencies are exactly golden ratio times Planck, because fractal phase conjugation is the reason photosynthesis exists. It's also the reason color exists. If you look at that optical distance, the visible spectrum from ultra-red to red, 350 to 700 nanometers as an octave, the photon obviously being a torus donut, then if you measure the tilt angle of that torus donut over the octave spectrum of visibility, you get a 180-degree tilt. And if you use the primary colors to measure the amount of tilt, green is 90 degree, orange is 45, and violet's 135. It's cubic. The only two angles of the tilt of the photon donut we call color that are not cubic are orange and blue, which turn out to be 63 and 117 degrees, which turn out to be simply the inner and outer angle of a dodeca. So you see, the photons get themselves into the angle of phase conjugate implosion, and we call that the physics of the reason color and rainbows exist. Evidence? The many rainbows that show up when Tibetan saints die, they've added the implosive compression that causes rainbows. That's well documented, actually. So to animate that geometry, see if our little animation is going to play here. This is called the Holy Grail, the only possible three-dimensional fractal, and the Grail is in the blood, and the Grail is in hydrogen, and that's literally implosion. And you see it's a cup within a cup that lasts forever. And if you look at that perfect flame in 3D in that nest, if we animate on the right, what a flame in mind is, actually sometimes called Merkaba, is that perfect stellation dodecikosa that allows a flame to embed. And all ratios in that flame, animated, are golden mean ratio. And if you rotate that here, I'm going to rotate it a little bit, that same golden spiral, you see how that creates the Grail cup and the swastika, which is simply the geometry of implosive charge compression. And so this is a picture of the adding and multiplying here that allows implosion on the right. You've seen this is the perfect embedding of dodecikosa, which permits this. So this brings us to the science of how that implosion is psychokinetic in the body, and we're going to use the example of rainmaking in Brazil. Thank you to Amar there, our hero. And so Amar helped us.
Before you go there, Dan, before you go there, is it possible to answer a few questions related to what you just spoke about?
As you wish, as you wish. Sure.
Madhavi or Ravi, would you like to give your question? There was a question about ghosts, your notion of ghosts, and the other one about life. If you had a notion of microvita and the life force of plant, how to produce the energy. Go ahead, Madhavi.
Just a minute. Dada, can you, Ravi, could you start, because I'm looking for my question. Is Ravi there? Okay, then I'll ask. Okay, there it is. Hello?
Hi.
Okay, I'll ask my question then. It's ghost. Can they also be a projection of our ectoplasmic mind? We're projecting this plasma from our mind, if either due to fear or concentrating on a certain person that has passed away. Is this possible?
Well, we believe, you know, I lived on a farm which had been for 30 years the site of spiritualism, so we're convinced the term ectoplasm refers to longitudinal interferometry. And yes, if you project enough charge, for example, if you had a severely traumatic emotion in one location in a room, that's where the ghost stays, because that's where the charge cloud remained and needs implosion in order to be delivered. So once we understand the physics of these things, for example, you can measure that ghost by a little lower temperature right in that spot. And that ghost needs a place to implode, or sacred space. By the way, that ghost is never going to show up inside an aluminum box. No, it's got the wrong dielectric. So once we understand the physics of ghosts and how they're delivered, we can actually deal with spiritualism using physics.
Okay. My second question is, could we tap the life force of plants to produce the energy we need for the world? I know Rudolf Steiner mentioned it somewhere in his books.
Well,
Are you familiar with that?
we, of course, in fact, Fields of Form, Vortex of Life, Lawrence Edwards' book on biodynamics, used the pine cone and the geometry of the pine cone imploding, changing its actual angle of implosion over the year as it modulates the amount of voltage it needs to get from gravity. So yes, the pine cone is making voltage from gravity. That's why they work good for rainmaking. And that's why that's how the pineal gland is built. Yes, the pine cone is a beautiful example of the physics, and I do mean physics of charge implosion. And so yes, the physics of how plants make life force is very instructive to how we need to make the negentropic life force to save the planet. Absolutely, I'm with you.
Thank you, Dan.
Valerie, you asked about...
That has another question about why Schumann resonance is used now to neutralize EMF.
Well,
but before that, maybe, did you finish about Madhavi's question, Ada's question about the plants to produce energy?
yes,
I think that was all.
we spoke about that.
That's,
Yeah.
I'm finished. I'm done. But Dana had an interesting question. Ravi had an interesting question. I can't find. Maybe you can find the question.
I wanted to ask why Schumann resonance?
Oh yeah. Can you hear me?
Why Schumann resonance is used to neutralize electrosmog?
Electromagnetic frequencies.
Pollution, yes. Yes. Well, the Schumann harmonic cascade, as we have newly proven, are actually golden ratio multiples of Planck, making that caduceus cascade implosive. So if you perfect the Schumann harmonic cascade, you can absolutely use it to reduce electrosmog and create life for sure. So actually, see, the original Schumann is about 7.29 hertz. No, I'm sorry, the original Schumann is around 7.83 hertz, the velocity, the speed of light around the circumference, whereas the actually correct Schumann would be about 7.29 hertz. So when they designed the planet to be negentropic, the Schumann isn't quite correct for implosion. And that cascade of completing those harmonics has to do with the physics of the rapture the Christians talked about. Because when that implosion is perfected, more people will lucid dream and the guns will melt.
Shall I read out Ravi's question, if there's no one else who has a question?
Ravi was starting to speak, but maybe you didn't hear him. Ravi?
Oh, no, I didn't, sorry. Is he there?
He's muted. Ravi? You're muted.
Let Dan continue, and then the questions can be asked.
Yeah, I was.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I was going to do another
Sorry about
15
that.
minutes.
My question.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. You're breaking.
I have another
Breaking.
15 minutes of slideshow, Valerie, and then we're going to do questions afterwards.
Maybe my connection's not good. You go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, okay. Well, just try to finish just a couple of thoughts. So the physics of rainmaking, and this is Amar's wonderful friend, the teacher, story, saying the kids gathered and they did this simple labyrinth work, assembling this spiral of charged stone, and then blessed them, and they created incredible storms, just like's been my experience during Kundalini. You can read all about this at goldenmean.info/rain. The point of view is the physics of rainmaking is the centripetal capacitance which causes vapor to share to make a droplet called precipitation, the physics of both magic and rainmaking. And that is why a child can put a hole in a cloud with their mind repeatedly, particularly if they're grounded, barefoot in the mud, or blissful. So the physics of rainmaking here is, if you read Trevor Constable's Weather Engineering on High Seas, the angle of the cone most effective for rainmaking was a 6-degree implosion cone. Here's the picture. And the diameter of the cloud busters are actually microwave tuned, and they need to be at the frequencies that fit my equation for microwave collimation. So basically, we now know why it has been measured that the spread of patriarchy causes deserts. It's because it prevents touch. So permission to touch is the fractal implosion, the definition of the feminine principle. So if you allow patriarchies to propagate, you create deserts around the planet because touch is forbidden, and then the water vapor cannot touch. So this is just a little animation of that implosion. And it's a reinforcement of the previous lecture about the power of the feminine, which is inherently the power of fractality. This is the harmonics from my equation, the harmonics of Schumann, mapped against the harmonics of the brain waves that make bliss, just to finish the thought from the previous slide. And this, we talked about the harmonics of the plasma in Therify on top. And this is a graphic prepared by Patrick, reinforcing what we're describing, that the physics of Kundalini are when these brain waves and these sacrocranial frequencies and these heart HRV frequencies, when they implode, you have Kundalini and bliss. And here's my equation in cycles per second and cycles per minute. And here is the sacrocranial frequencies, fit the equation. Here are the brain waves frequencies, fit the equation. And here are the Schumann frequencies, fit the equation. And they all fit this map of perfected implosion, enabling bliss process. This is how the definition of everything we call sacred dimension also fits this simple equation. Here is every major unit of length in history that has been named sacred. And we see the Raman, the Teotihuacan unit, the cubit, pace, megalithic yard, the yard, and the foot. And you see this geometry is a charge cascade. So if you get the length to fit Planck, you implode charge, and that is named sacred space, sacred dimension, sacred architecture. Here are the frequencies of the low frequencies of the spine liquid pump, long tidal, mid tidal, Mayer wave, and base tidal frequencies, well documented in the sacrocranial literature, which are the physics of Kundalini and bliss. Remember, if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed, up ledger. So these are the frequencies of the spine liquid pump, and these are the frequencies of my equation, and you see how they fit. This is the cascade of the pump of the spine, the serpent up the spine, the physics of Kundalini. So that imploding spine liquid then is delivered to the high brain in a rotating torus of infrasound. We're going to see the ringing in the ears heard by meditators when they hear their ancestors. But here, this homunculus is the map of this torus of the delivery of Kundalini to the high brain, which is why you feel this red-hot lightning poker up your tailbone, because there's a map of flux density being delivered to the toroidal map on the surface of the brain called homunculus. So is it all in your head? Yes. But is it in your spine? Yes. And this is Bentoff, my teacher, measuring this with capacitive accelerometrics, and I worked with him in that lab. And these are the frequencies he then measured from thousands of meditators who had Kundalini, who then reported the frequencies they heard ringing in their ear, sometimes named Sangreal, song in the blood, voice of ancestor. And Valerie often talks about which ear is ringing tells her which ancestor is calling. We understand more of the physics here. So the ringing in the ears, you hear Sangreal from this bliss, and this is completely different than akaphenia, and I hear this a lot. Actually, generally fit the equation for charge implosion. Bentoff talked about this a great deal. We don't have time here. And we talked about the frequencies of this HRV, and I'm not going to talk about the physics too much here. We call this Einstein-induced insanity, but basically if you understood why objects fall to the ground, you can understand fractality. I think this is very helpful for the conversation today. This is the geometry of the dance called the Infinity Walk. Deborah Sundbeck-Lawrence, my friend, who in her book demonstrated if you teach a child to walk this figure 8 with the cross crawl, as the corpus callosum gets measurably hot, you heat up the corpus callosum, forcing the blood flow to implode at the center of your head, and you can eliminate 8 years of reading loss due to dyslexia by teaching a child how to do it. And this is the physics of why it works. It's named phase conjugation. And this is how the Olmec talked to their ancestors. They used the same black obsidian phase conjugate mirror that Nostradamus did, and the same one that John Dee did. So phase conjugate mirrors, these black magic mirrors that the Olmec used for ancestor communication, work because the ancestors are communicating in this longitudinal interferometric electromagnetic field, which requires phase conjugate mirror. So the physics of scrying, in short, like when Nostradamus learned how to put the right coating on the bottom of his scrying cup. And this is when Korotkov first measured which kids could see without their eyes, was golden ratio in brain waves. Obviously, we're out of time here, so I'm just going to go on. But this is actually the golden ratio in brain waves at the top of the head, the 3D measurements of bliss process. I'm just going to show maybe one or two more slides. We're out of time. But here is where the physicists, Tiller, measured that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. I am the first one to describe the physics of consciousness and bliss of why. It's evident by measurement that if you focus your mind, it makes electric fields compress. When you understand the physics of why, you can understand the physics of evolution, because you actually understand charge implosion. This is from Elizabeth Rauscher, measuring the magnetic harmonics that reduce pain. And these are the harmonics she used on the bottom and the harmonics Priori and I use on top for pain reduction. Basically, pain is failure to compress charge. That's the definition. So pain is the body aura plasma field bleeding charge due to broken fractality, failure to compress. You restore compression, electrically or mechanically, and you eliminate pain. Therify.net is famous in 25 countries. We can deal with localized pain, often in one session. Long-term or chronic pain, not always, but often we can help, but it takes more sessions. But you see what the physics of pain is. Now, I see there's many more slides here, but I believe we're out of time. Would you prefer that I answer questions now, Valeria? What would you suggest?
Dan, it would be nice if you could go back to the rainmaking story.
Okay.
Amar prepared himself, and he made his video with his teacher.
Yes.
And the testimony of the children, and it was such an amazing story.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if Amar could talk and ask a question himself. Amar.
So this is the story from the teacher. Yes.
The story.
Yeah, there's the story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Can we stop the slides, maybe?
Oh, of course, sure. I'll turn this. This is the story from that teacher.
This is the story.
Yeah.
This is the story.
But I'll let Amar take the screen. I'll stop the share. Go ahead. Go ahead, Amar. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, basically, last year, I didn't know Dan, but I knew Akashic, and she's so lovely. And Brazil was on fire. It was on all international news. And I didn't even ask, but one day when they must have been worried, and she introduced me to Dan on the phone. And they were so kind. They said, what can we do? Because they were seeing all these, it was like 60% of Brazil's forest in our region. And it was all getting close to the cities, including mine. And it was a very sad situation, and they were the fire areas. It would have been a tragic situation. So Dan told me, well, you can make rain. Well, I didn't believe it. Okay, I didn't know him then. Now I know him good. And but I was desperate, really desperate. And he explained to me how to do that, and we passed it on to the kids. There was only one school that I found open. And it happened, and it happened. And he taught me, and then I've been practicing. I've been practicing, and it works. Okay, so that was that experience, and I'd like to ask one question of something similar. Okay, if possible.
Go ahead.
My wife's great uncle made rain too. He was a medicine man, and in the rainforest, when they slash and burn and create these cattle farms, he didn't like the idea of killing snakes. So the ranchers would call him because he would always ask, please let me do it. And he would go there and he would do his thing in the pastures, and all these snakes that were filling the paths without killing no snakes, of course, and he would just do his thing and the snakes would go. Now, I trained myself to do that years ago, and I moved poisonous snakes with my hands and take them into the forest. Now, me and Dan are white guys, okay? And he taught me how to make rain, and for years I've known this snake thing. Now, Dan, I have a question. This medicine man, this great uncle of my wife, he was actually jailed for this, okay? And he was released because he cured the jailer, Okay, so everybody knew him. So I want to, was he a mystic? Is this acquired knowledge through trial and error or ancestral memory, like you said? Or were they scientists in their own way?
I think it's a beautiful question. You come from a country known for shaman, and I believe the word shaman, Shem, access to a black hole on sun god, refers to someone who's learned to be plasma projective. And obviously our ancestors learned plasma projection. You know, you see the famous Carlos Castaneda tensegrity movement. You pull your aura from the earth like a carrot from the ground, and you blow and you split and you project your aura. Of course, shaman are famous for dying young because they tend to fight when they project their aura. But to become plasma projective is the issue of evolution for sure. So ancient shamanism was a beautiful survival plasma science for sure. In fact, our friend John McGovern in Australia, who claims to be able to read every cave painting on every continent, does so because he believes he understood that shamans were essentially dealing with fragments of plasma shadows that became their alphabet and their painting. So what they were seeing was these plasma shadows, the physics of clairvoyance, the physics of 5D, and to get phase coherent enough to see these weak plasma fields is not just shamanism or clairvoyance, but it's the physics of longitudinal interferometry. And yes, they didn't need to be physicists to deal with this because this was survival related. The thing is now we need physics more than ever because we will never convince governments and universities to use the physics of consciousness until it's a shareable wave, which is literally measurable. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question here. Why do you think, because many times we can access ancestors and we can access other states of consciousness, etc., in dreams? Why in dreams?
Well,
almost like many times in dreams, we actually have this capacity of going out of
yes,
body.
Exactly.
Out of body experience.
Yes.
Why in dream states?
Well, we're saying, first of all, it is evident, we think by measurement, that the ability to lucid dream is the major predictor of whether you will take memory through death. And further, we know in physics that the plasma field, called phase conjugate plasma implosion, therify.net, dramatically triggers lucid dreaming. We thank Maya from Paris and Athens for detailed reports. So the reason we're able to help trigger lucid dreaming is because we charge this longitudinal coherent plasma body, the Ba from the Ka or the Kesjan body or rainbow light body. We have too many words for it and not enough physics for it. But the ability to project the plasma of your aura coherently requires you get centripetal first, implosive, and then your aura becomes coherent enough to propagate. You know, in the book 9 Faces of Christ, the hero first can only take their vision and not their smell. And then they can take their vision, their hearing, and then their smell, and then their taste. So gradually you learn to take more organs of perception with you into your dream. That's been observed. The physics is the increasing coherence in the propagation of your aura as a longitudinal light body. So the physics of dreaming is highly instructive to the physics of spirituality. And coherent dreaming is literally the physics of propagating. For example, you're more likely to be able to exchange information in a lucid dream with someone if both sender and receiver are at a longitudinal node. The same reason where Therify remote healing works better. And the same reason why Cozy Rev mirrors produce professional telepathy. Only when you're at these magnetic line crossings where you get this magnetic compression effect where the send and receive points. And this is an introduction to the physics of stargates as well.
Dan, if I may, there is questions about successful dying. It thinks it's a bit relating to what you're talking about now. And the other questions, well, I answered in short. It's related.
I found Dada's question. What does phone calls to ancestors mean? Where are ancestors conceived to be? What about the reincarnation of the ancestors? Once they've reincarnated, presumably they can't be contacted, yes?
Well, we learned from the Aboriginals, called songline dreaming tracks, that ancestral memory is the most important feature of civilization. And obviously there's a reason for that, because it's the physics of survival memory that's contained in a compression array. So the Aboriginals knew is that they needed to have these song lines, these longitudinal nodes, to communicate with ancestors. It just happens that our friend Korotkov measured it. He followed the Korotkov to the Kogi to where they made phone calls to ancestors and measured the fractality of the air, which is the dielectric constant which predicts charge distribution efficiency. So simply, sacred space was electrically required for ancestor phone calls. So that array of longitudinal nodes, which we now know is fractal, dodecaecosa, the sacred grid of the earth, the pyramids, all these sacred sites are located, is an array for these longitudinal nodes to contain ancestral memory. Simple educational example, when Jodie Foster got inside a pent-dodeca to travel, time travel in the movie Contact, she ended up lucid dreaming to talk to her ancestor father. So this is a compressional nodal array of living interlifetime plasma memory, which is a survival memory library, call it Communion of Saints, ancestral memory, Akashic records. And once you know something about the physics, you can do a better job of dealing with the library. And it's true, only those who are very evolved could contain some of their memory in that distributed array and be incarnated at the very same time. But it's not impossible, and I'm sure evolved beings inhabit this array much more consciously.
Do we infringe on anyone by accessing the Akashic record?
Well, remember what we're saying, the Akashic record is the same as the fractal distribution of charge, which is the nodal array of this longitudinal interferometry, and literally is accessible by only there can a shareable wave survive, meaning only pure intention, meaning only pure principle. So if you're not thinking about something which benefits everyone, you can't be part of the compression that lets you in the door. So if you want a library card, you have to study what pure intention. It's the same way, you're not going to die very well if you're angry, because you're not a shareable wave and you won't compress very well. Whereas if you've been thinking about the pure principle of survival of everyone in perfect sharing, then you got a library card.
There's another question from Ada Madavi about how to improve the brains of children in school, and she had also a question about how to repair the nervous system, but maybe it's related, I don't know.
Well, you know, the situation in schools is getting desperate. We now know what building will cause a seed to grow. It's implosive capacitance, which is biologic architecture, which means living material, wood and stone and natural fabric, which every Steiner child knows. Whereas if you go into a school of steel and aluminum and electrosmog and Wi-Fi, it's the opposite of charge distribution efficiency. So obviously focused attention is not possible because charge implosion is not possible. It's instructive that in Finland, when they passed a new law, the kids would be barefoot in schools. The learning went up so dramatically because they became fractally grounded. So yes, we must learn electrical hygiene in order to allow our children to fabricate attention. And this is, of course, diet and environment and sacred space. But everything about modern civilization, sadly, having not recognized the physics of what attention is, we have metal buildings, we have electrosmog, we have Wi-Fi, we have everything that prevents a child from achieving centripetal force. So yes, we need to work on an environment for kids, and then basically it starts with nature, I suppose.
Grounding.
Yes, thank you.
And about the nervous system that has been damaged from early childhood, how can you repair a nervous system that gets very stressed very easily because of noise of all directions?
Well, you know, they say remove the thorn and God will heal. Well, you know, first you need to get the child into a place where the air is fractal, sacred, you know, biologic structures where their aura can breathe. And then when the child is in a safe space, then you can deal with what is effectively post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the mechanism there is simple. At the moment of maximum stress, there was a discontinuity of memory created. And that break in the fractality of memory is the physics of the disconnect. So you need to go to the moment of maximum pain and restore the memory of the and literally recreate that maximum compression. And instead of dissociation at the moment of maximum pain, you have to remember at the moment of maximum pain, and that pulls yourself back together and reassembles your coherent light body.
I would like to ask you if it would be possible to explain a bit more about the Gaia hypothesis.
Well, that's a very appropriate question. Simply put, Lovelock, after Lovelock wrote the software SimEarth, where if you put Dolman at fractal nodes, the rate of evolution increased. He wrote that software. He proved that Gaia was negentropic, which is to say self-organizing, which is to say the temperature, the pressure, the humidity, the umpteen different variables, all for some reason remained within the spectra to permit life. He called that negentropy. He named it, or her. He named her Gaia. Now, he didn't have a clue what made Gaia negentropic. The new information is, I believe we now know, that if you take the Schumann harmonics measure, you get that green cascade I showed many times in the slide, which are all exactly Golden ratio times Planck or very close. So that's called implosion. And that creates a charged bubble around the Earth, which is negentropic or self-organizing. Because you see, when the implosion is present, it means that any wave which is out of phase, which is not shareable, will be self-canceled at center. It's why your aura will have no problem with parasites, astral or intestinal, if you have bliss, because the presence of implosion burns anything which is not shareable. And that's the origin of negentropy, which happens to be the title of my book.
So really, this explains, we can say then that the planet, Gaia, is spiritual. It's a spiritual entity.
Wonderfully true, but remember, we have limitations. And the limitations here are the fact that Gaia's negentropy is limited by the stability, among other things, of the Schumann harmonics. So many things were done to rearrange those harmonics to make the planet implosive, to restore atmosphere. This was called planet taming. Unfortunately, the planet is now losing its atmosphere and losing the negentropy of Gaia for the same reason that the children in schools where the Schumann harmonics cannot make it in the door, those children are losing negentropy too. So we must very soon start teaching our children the physics of negentropy, or we don't have a prayer. Starting with teaching our children the correct physics, which is the universe is not condemned to chaos or entropy.
Okay. I have one question left. Can I ask that?
Sure.
Okay. Can you change, if you change the waves of an apple, could you turn it in, say, into an orange or vice versa by changing the waves?
Well, what we have said here is that we can increase the freshness of an apple, or we've proven we can increase how long the flowers last by making the electric field implosive. But now what actually created the shape of that apple at the...
And the taste?
Yes. Well, I think we can improve the taste as well. I think that's what freshness is, really, in part. But what actually determined the shape of that apple was the genetic component at the core. And the genetic component, now we know that our ancestors were cloners and they were hacking up the DNA right and left. That's obviously true of Enki Abra. However, there is a deeper sense of that. If you know the book, it's called The Willed Mutation of the Species by Sat Prem, that if 1,000 ancestors yearn for the same thing at the moment of death, that will mutate the species. Let me give you an example. I have a fragment of the soul memory of Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun could make rain, as can I sometimes. And I know why. Because after several hundred generations of pharaohs who knew they would get fired if they couldn't make rain, their children were able to make rain. Now, how do you suppose that happened? That's called the direction of yearning. That's an example of the willed mutation of the species.
Thank you.
Did you have something in mind, Madhavi, talking about
well, in connection with microvita, Sakar,
can you read the one of Ananta? There is a thing there from Ananta. Can you see?
Maybe let Madhavi talk.
There was known in connection with microvita that you can actually, in the future, if we understand the physics of microvita, we could turn, say, an apple into an orange or vice versa. So that's in relationship to that I was asking the question. But maybe it's too complex.
Well, everything I spoke about in my lecture began and ended with measurement, and that's what made what I teach shareable. So as an engineer, I find it inappropriate to discuss what hasn't been measured, because that's what gave me a language of rigor. I think the conversations about microvita in Ananda Marga are probably wonderfully useful, but since there's not measurement there, it doesn't fall within the purview of an electrical engineer to have a conversation yet. We think we've measured life force, we think we've identified it, and we think we know exactly how it's created and how it's quantized. And we've commercialized that, as you see, in many ways. But it's true, we have more things to learn, and one of those things probably is the fact that, yes, you can morph something with intent, and that is where we're going with this, so I like your question.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
There is one thing that our master really taught us, which is this game between a centripetal force and a centrifugal force. And he identified all centripetal forces as the spiritual force. This is the spiritual force because it attracts to the nucleus. And the centripetal force, it creates distance from the nucleus. What do you think about this?
Well, I think we're right on the same wavelength here. That's exactly what I'm saying, is that the origin of centripetal forces is the origin of negentropy, and calling that spiritual is a great start. So yeah, we're together on this. But that's the tragedy, you see, that physics hasn't known the cause of anything centripetal up until the point of Schauberger doing implosion. When his water vortex was piezoelectric, started spontaneously getting colder was the moment it started making voltage from gravity, and zero-point energy was invented on this planet. And we call our imploder.com Schauberger's dream. So yes, implosion as the mechanism of centripetal force is exquisitely the heart of this matter. Now, further, what we're saying is that when implosion is successful, for example, Kundalini and Bliss, and it centers in that lightning bolt. When people experience lightning, they have transformation, whether it's Tesla or the books on near-death experience. So when that compression is completed, the next thing that's possible after successful compression is successful radiance, and that is the centrifugal force. Why a rose can unpack so beautifully is because first it has been packed so beautifully.
Okay, now I don't know if there's another question, but this brings me to the point of that we know that for us, Kundalini rise and implodes when there is extreme longing or extreme love. When this love and longing towards divinity is accelerated, then that's when there is a rising of that energy. How do you explain?
Well, maybe I don't explain anything, but I love the concept. Actually, after I emerged from Buddhism, when the Buddha said eliminate desire, and then I went to the Gurdjieff school, and Gurdjieff insisted, charge the battery of yearning, Gurdjieff used to keep saying. And it was at the Gurdjieff school that I hit the first Kundalini. I was doing sacred gymnastic. I was double Scorpio and a virgin and eating the first live food of my life. And I started to have explosions in my tailbone. But my Kundalini story is all at goldenmean.info/Kundalini, where we also have our recent professional film on this subject. But yes, in fact, it is about yearning, because it's actually what I think the Sufis meant when they said charge the battery of yearning was that the story was a bit longer in Sufi. It started by saying, from length is longing born, which means from the illusion of separation comes the possibility of the yearning for oneness.
Beautiful.
There is, if you want, I read this question here from Ananta. In our philosophy of microbiota, it is proposed that we must do research to revert nuclear explosion, and we will be able to neutralize atomic radiation. This would be great to solve the Chernobyl and Japan catastrophe. Has this ever been discussed in the quantum physics?
Oh, that's exactly the right question, and the answer is very simple. Absolutely yes. It starts when Bruce Cathy famously measured that at these longitudinal crosspoint nodes, there was a dramatic reduction in nuclear critical mass, which, you know, fits the physics. And now we know the physics of why the capacitor caused the Ark of the Covenant was originally built to contain radioactivity non-destructively. And all this story about plague of Azoth is actually the story of radioactive poisoning. So absolutely, any truly implosive field reduces radioactivity measurably, as Uri Geller measured focused attention of humans reduce radioactivity measurably. So and even Keshe's plasma gas, which is nanomaterial, reduced radioactivity measurably. So the physics of implosive capacitance is a beautiful, which is the physics of life force, is a beautiful introduction to the physics of radioactive containment. Absolutely yes. And the physics is so simple. Look, what is radioactivity but the unpacking of the electric field due to inadequate centripetal force at the core? So obviously, if you knew how to make centripetal fields, you could eliminate radioactivity, no question.
Some other question that was challenging also, apart from radioactivity, is how can you deal with Morgellons? Are there some frequencies that can help it, or even our inner work on our brain or something? Well, there was a question from Lila. Maybe Lila, you want to come front and Lila, you want to join and ask your question? Okay, then do you have any solution for?
Yes. Hi. Hello.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I was thinking about, because with these vaccines and everything, and the tests and the Morgellons are quite into the atmosphere, into the people right now. So is there anything we can do if we get Morgellons?
You know, my best friend, originally Russell Wright, wrote a book about Morgellons, and it's a very complex subject. It leads ultimately to even the presence of parasitic nanostructures, the story of the black goo, for example. And this is very deep and heavy physics. But the short answer would be that the more implosion in your aura, now, the more it ejects all forms of parasitism. But that is oversimplistic. But it is true. We know, for example, now, I would recommend, for example, Harold Kautzvilla's videos on the origins of Morgellons. I'm sorry, the origins of the black goo, for example, present in the Kaaba stone, we think, which is a invasive nanite AI from outside our solar system, and which is related to Morgellons, that these invasive nanostructures, ultimately we need to learn, because these are not just the scourge of the planet, these are the scourge of many advanced cultures in our galactic sector. And I think Johann Fritz's story at Super Soldier Talk is instructive, where they even found some of the Lyrans who had found a particular green gas which could eject this black goo related to Morgellons. So basically, the short introduction is implosion. The long story is, you know, if immune health is defined as fractality and heart rate variability, as medicine has proven, then, in fact, that harmonic inclusiveness taken to climax is the implosion we're describing, and that is what ejects everything foreign from the aura. In the meantime, we need to recognize a fundamental difference between artificial intelligence and human soul at a fundamental level of physics in order to even have these conversations. And we have web articles about that, which I will share later.
This comes at the right time, the question about any device, Schumann physics for 5G and other electromagnetic burden from Sujata.
Unfortunately, 5G kinds of pollution and high frequency, even Wi-Fi, is highly invasive. Even Bluetooth, these are highly invasive and highly destructive to the spiritual aura and a serious problem. And I mean, there are some things you can do to create a bubble of sacred space and altar in your house, a place where you focus the longitudinal. So you make a bit of implosive compression and you will make a bubble. For example, we made a labyrinth well doused in our yard, physics of rainmaking in Western New York, and it made a microclimate and to some extent will keep out some of that electrosmog. But ultimately, you know, I think a move to nature is necessary. I mean, I personally was in Italy during the months when they installed Wi-Fi and 4G in the microwave towers inside the schools without telling people, and you could feel the nausea radiating through those villages, and the children were losing their souls, and nobody was doing anything about it. So this is a tragedy. There is no question.
Okay, this is
Wow.
a very powerful ending for a very enriching and incredible presentation. Thank you
And
so
this really
much.
brings more questions, and one of the next questions is how can humanity, create how can science walk hand in hand with humanity and human welfare and human well-being and human health and not against it? This is a big question.
You know, the way a beehive will swarm when there is a collective bliss named body politic, body polis. The only real definition of politics is a collective bliss cocoon that becomes navigable. And that is how a gene pool can steer through the heart of the sun, actually. And that is clearly a clue. Once we understand enough about the physics of bliss, it becomes the definition of all forms of government, that plasma cocoon. And that's how we evolve into stars. And every ancient religion began as a sun god religion for that reason, the plasma intelligence of our local star.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
It has something to do with what you just finished saying that just reminded. I saw you in a documentary and you explained that when humanity beats with one heart, then that's when everything will come together. And scientists, you're an honest scientist, okay? You're not a bot scientist. So I understand that, and that's for Radha's question. But can you explain, because it's so eloquently in the documentary, the way you explain how one human heartbeat will be able to change everything.
You know, about 40 years,
remember, but
about 40 years ago, we started on a project called the Harmonic Module, which was a biofeedback environment where ultimately millions of people could learn to link their heartbeats by measurement. Now, that would be the physics of creating this bliss cocoon. And indeed, you know, this originally was called the Heart Tuner, and then we had iThrive. And now Patrick is wonderfully programming iThrive to be able to teach groups of people to link hearts. You know, first it starts with your rave concert or DJ. Everybody wants to link hearts with them, the musical key signature of the drummer. But eventually that master drummer is the collective mind of the earth itself. And linking those hearts is actually teachable. We know, for example, that on 11 different occasions when more than 1 million children sang the same song together, there was a dramatic change in the solar flares. And that tells you something.
There was